I want to tell you about the night I walked out of a wedding reception to get some air and found a woman in a white dress sitting on the curb outside the venue with her heels in her hand and her mascara running and no coat in 40-degree weather in Savannah, Georgia. I want to tell you about what I did and what she said 20 minutes later when she stopped crying long enough to look at me properly and ask, in a voice that was genuinely confused rather than rhetorical, why I was still there. But before I tell you any of that, if you've ever done something small for a stranger that turned into something you could not have planned, leave a like. Because nothing about that night was planned, and I would not change a single part of it. I should tell you that I almost did not go to that wedding at all. The groom, Patrick, was my college roommate and one of my oldest friends. I had known him for 12 years, through 2 other relationships and 3 apartments, and one brief period where he was convinced he wanted to move to Portugal that had lasted about 4 months and ended when he discovered he did not speak Portuguese. He was one of those people you keep in your life because they make the version of you that shows up around them slightly better than the one that shows up everywhere else. The bride was Cecilia Marsh. I had met her 6 times over the course of their 2-year relationship. She was a graphic designer from Charleston who was sharp and funny and had clear opinions about fonts in a way that I found both excessive and charming. Patrick was visibly happy around her in the specific way of a man who had stopped performing happiness and was simply experiencing it. I had no reason to expect the evening to be anything other than straightforward. I drove down to Savannah on a Friday. The ceremony was at 4 at a venue near Forsyth Park, one of those old brick buildings with wrought iron details and Spanish moss in the trees outside, and the specific smell of history that Savannah does better than anywhere I have been. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Cecilia cried when she walked in. Patrick cried when she reached him, which he would deny to anyone who asked, but which I saw clearly from the 4th row and filed away for appropriate future use. They said their vows. Everyone applauded. The light through the windows was golden. The reception was in the same building, in a larger room, with a band and table set with white linens and enough flowers to account for someone's entire monthly budget. I found my seat, talked to the people around me, ate the food, watched Patrick dance with his mother in a way that nearly got me, and generally had the kind of evening a wedding reception is designed to produce. Around 8:30, I stepped outside. Not because anything was wrong. I am the kind of person who needs air at parties periodically. Not from unhappiness, just from the accumulated weight of noise and light and conversation that builds up in enclosed spaces and eventually requires a few minutes of dark and quiet to disperse. I had been to this venue before, and I knew there was a side door that led out onto a small brick courtyard with a low wall along the edge and a view of the street and the oak trees beyond it. I pushed open the side door and stepped into the October night. She was sitting on the low wall, white dress, long, with a small train that had been gathered up beside her on the brick, both heels in one hand, bare feet on the ground. Hair that had been up at some point and was mostly still up, except for the pieces that had come loose around her face. Head slightly bent. I understood in about 3 seconds. I stood for a moment in the doorway. The door was weighted and swung back toward me. I let it close behind me. She heard it and looked up. Her face was the face of a person who had been crying for a while and had reached the stage past crying where everything goes still and raw and the world looks slightly unreal. She looked at me and I looked at her and she said, with a calm that was clearly costing her something, "The reception is inside." "I know," I said. I needed air. She looked at the courtyard. "This is the only outside. I'm aware of that," I said. "I'll stay over here." I moved to the far end of the low wall and sat down, which put about 12 feet of brick between us, and looked at the oak tree across the street the way a person looks at a tree when they are giving someone space without leaving. She watched me for a moment. Then she looked back at the street. The October air in Savannah at night is not warm, It is the kind of cool that is comfortable in a suit jacket, but becomes cold quickly if you are sitting still in a strapless dress with no shoes and nothing else. I noticed this about 90 seconds after sitting down, which was around the same time I noticed she had started pulling her arms slightly in toward her body in the involuntary way of someone who is cold but is not going to say so, because cold is the least of her current problems. I took off my jacket. I walked the 12 feet of brick wall and held it out to her without a word. She looked at it, then at me. "I don't know you," she said. "I know," I said. "It's cold." She looked at the jacket for another moment. Then she took it and put it around her shoulders, pulling it closed in the front with both hands, and looked back at the street. I went back to my end of the wall and looked at the oak tree. We sat like that for a while, maybe 5 minutes, maybe closer to 10. The band inside was playing something with a steady beat that came through the brick walls in a muffled way that felt very far from where we were. Then, she said, to the street, "He didn't do anything wrong." I waited. "I want to be clear about that," she said. "He's a good man. He has been a good man for 2 years." "I understand," I said. She looked over at me. "Do you?" "No," I said, "but I believe you." She looked back at the street. That seemed to be the right answer. A few more minutes passed. A car went by slowly. The Spanish moss in the oak tree moved in a small wind. She said, "I was standing at the back of the room, after the ceremony, during cocktail hour, and I was watching him talk to his friends, and I thought, he is going to be exactly this happy for the rest of his life. And then I thought, I am not sure I am going to be able to keep up with that." She stopped. I did not say anything. Not because I had nothing to say, but because she was not finished, and I knew it. She said, "That is not a reason to walk out of your own wedding reception. I am aware of that." She paused. "But I have been not finishing thoughts for 11 months, and I did not know how to be in that room and not finish another one. The October night held that for a moment. Before I continue, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been in the middle of something you had built carefully for a long time, and suddenly understood that the thing you had built and the person you actually were had quietly stopped being the same shape?" Leave a comment, because that was what she was describing on that courtyard wall, and I had been that person once, and it was the reason I knew not to argue with what she had just said. I said, "What's the thought you finished tonight?" She looked at me. It was the first time since I sat down that she looked at me fully, not at the street, not at the jacket, at me. She said, "That I have been so careful to be what this looked like that I forgot to check whether I wanted to be inside it." The band inside shifted into something slower. Someone laughed behind the brick wall, muffled and warm. The party was still happening. The party did not know. I looked at the oak tree. I said, "I was engaged once. I called it off 4 months before the date." She was quiet. I said, "I had built the whole thing correctly. The right person by every measure I had been using. The right timeline. The right picture. And one morning I got up and understood that I had been building for the picture rather than the life. And I did not know how to tell anyone that without it sounding like a critique of her, which it was not." She said, "How did you tell her?" "Badly at first," I said. "Then, better." It took 2 conversations. She pulled the jacket a little tighter. Did she understand? "Eventually," I said. "Not at first. She was angry for a long time, and she had the right to be. But she built something good after. She's married now. She has a daughter." She looked at me once about 2 years later at a mutual friend's birthday, and I could tell she knew it had been the right thing. "How could you tell?" "Because she didn't look at me like someone who had been wronged," I said. She looked at me like someone who had been redirected. The woman in the white dress was quiet for a long time. The moss moved again. Somewhere inside the venue, a toast was happening. I could hear the rise and fall of a voice through the walls. She said, "His name is Patrick." "I know," I said. She looked at me sharply. "I'm a guest," I said. "I came out for air." Her expression moved through several things quickly. Then she said, "Who are you to him?" "College roommate," I said. 12 years. She looked at the oak tree. Of all the people in that building, I know. She put her face in her hands, not crying, just holding it there for a moment the way a person does when they need their hands to be doing something that isn't nothing. Then, she said, through her hands, "What do I do?" I said, "That's not a question I can answer." She looked up. "But I can tell you what I know about Patrick," I said. "He is the kind of man who will be upset. He will need time. He will probably not understand right away. And then he will. He always does, eventually. He has a very long patience for things that matter to him." She looked at her heels in her hand. The small stones set into them caught the light from the door. "Does he know you're out here?" she asked. "No," I said. "Are you going to tell him?" I looked at her directly. "I'm going to go back in there and be his friend. What you do next is not something I get to advise on." She nodded slowly. Then she said, "You've been out here for 20 minutes. I said, "The air's good." Something crossed her face that was almost a laugh. Not quite, but the edge of one. She said, "You didn't ask me any questions." No. Most people would have asked a lot of questions. Most people, I said, would have told you that you were making a mistake or that you weren't. Either way, they would have been talking about themselves. She looked at me for a moment. "You're a strange person to find outside a wedding." "I'm a strange person in general," I said. "This is just a context that makes it more obvious." This time, it was an actual laugh. Small, surprised, real. She stood from the wall. The white dress settled around her. She was tall, taller than she had looked sitting down. And she held her heels in one hand and stood in her bare feet on the brick courtyard, like a woman who had stopped performing the evening and was simply inside it. She held out my jacket. I took it. She looked at the door. "I need to go back in and talk to him," she said. Her voice was quiet and clear and did not shake. "Whatever comes next, it starts with that." "Yes," I said. She looked at me one more time. "Thank you." "For the jacket," I said. She shook her head. "Not only the jacket." She went back through the side door. It closed behind her with the soft, weighted sound of a door that knows it is a threshold. I stood in the courtyard for a few more minutes. The oak tree held still. The band inside had moved into something upbeat, and the muffled bass came through the bricks in steady pulses. Somewhere in that building, a conversation was beginning that was going to be the hardest one two people had ever had with each other. And it was going to happen in the middle of a wedding reception. And it was going to be the most honest thing either of them had said in 11 months. I put my jacket back on. It was still warm. I went inside. Patrick found me about 40 minutes later. He looked like a man who had just had a conversation that had taken everything he had, but he did not look destroyed. He looked like someone who had been told a true thing and was deciding what to build with it. He sat down beside me. He did not say much. I did not ask much. That was the right kind of friendship for that moment. After a while, he said, "She said she talked to someone outside." I said nothing. He looked at me sideways. "Brick courtyard? Oak tree?" I looked at my water glass. He exhaled once, long and slow. Then he said, "Did you know?" "No," I said. "I went out for air." He was quiet. Then, "What did you say to her?" "I said I knew you well enough to know you'd eventually understand," I said, "even if it took time." He looked at the table. His hands were flat on the white linen. "That's it?" "That was most of it." He nodded once, slowly. His jaw moved. I watched him hold himself together, the way a person holds something carefully when they know it is fragile and worth keeping. He said quietly, "She's not wrong." "I know," I said. He looked at me. "That's not what a best friend is supposed to say. It's what this one is going to say," I said. He sat with that for a moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile. Just the acknowledgement of one. We sat there together until the reception ended, which it did at midnight the way all things that have run their course end, with the lights coming up gently and the band packing their instruments, and the last guests filtering out into the Savannah night through the front doors. Patrick and Cecilia left together. Not because everything was resolved. Not because the conversation in the middle of the reception had fixed anything. But because they were two honest people who had just started telling the truth to each other for the first time in 11 months. And that was worth walking out of a building together, even when you did not yet know where you were walking to. I watched them go from the doorway. Then I walked to my car under the Spanish moss and the October sky and thought about a woman in a white dress sitting on a low brick wall with her heels in her hand and a stranger's jacket on her shoulders, saying the truest thing she had said in almost a year. Some nights what a person needs is not advice, not a solution, not even comfort in the formal sense. Just someone to sit 12 feet away on a brick wall and not leave until the cold gets too much, and hand over their jacket without making it a thing. I have told very few people this story. The ones I have told always ask what happened to Patrick and Cecilia. The answer is they separated, formally and without bitterness, about 3 months later. Patrick took it hard and then took it well, which is the only way I know how to describe it. Cecilia moved back to Charleston. They have not spoken much, but they have spoken. Patrick told me once, about a year after, that the conversation in the middle of the reception had been the first time he had heard her fully. He said he had been so certain she was happy that he had stopped checking. He said the thing that stayed with him most was that she had not blamed him. She had only said she had forgotten to check whether she wanted to be inside it. He said he understood that. He said he had been doing the same thing. That is what two honest people sound like when they finally tell the truth. Not angry, not pointing. Just two people in a white linen room saying the thing that had been true for a while and finally had enough space to be said out loud. I still have the jacket. It is the navy one I wear in October when the air gets that particular edge. I put it on sometimes and think about a brick courtyard and an oak tree with Spanish moss and a woman who walked back through a side door to start the hardest conversation of her life. I hope she is somewhere good. I think she is. If this story stayed with you, leave a like. And if you know what it feels like to sit beside someone in the dark and simply not leave, subscribe. The next story is already waiting. If you stayed to the very end, comment. He gave her the jacket without making it a thing.